Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm Vincent Franchini from Tumblr House here with Charles Coulombe.
Happy Advent.
So I watched two good documentaries on EWTN this past month. First one is titled A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. It focused on Saul Alinsky, but it also talked about how secularism, liberalism, socialism got injected into our society. Have you seen the film? What do you think, and what are your thoughts on Saul Alinsky?
Well, I haven't seen the film, so I have no thoughts on it.
Oh.
But I have read Saul Alinsky's Roll Call for Radicals and his Reveille for Radicals. And, of course, Saul Alinsky did a lot for reducing us to the garbage pot we've become. I mean that in a nice way, of course. Alinsky originally worked for Al Capone, and then he got communism the way some people get religion.
Wow.
And what I think is funny about him is that on his books it says he has a distinguished criminological career. And I looked at that and I didn't know a distinguished criminal career. There's a difference. But no, Alinsky was a smart guy, hated everything decent, and provided very useful handbooks for those who want to destroy anything decent. And it's been very successful. So what's not to like? Nothing succeeds like success, as we say in America. Everybody loves a winner. You'd even had dioceses like the Diocese of El Paso and the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, back in the day, not now, that endorsed Alinskyite organizing groups. The United Neighborhoods Organization and things like that. So, I mean, it was very, very successful. What's not to like?
Wow. It said in one of his books, I think the dedication page was to Lucifer or Satan, the first radical.
Yeah, absolutely. Who, by the way, was actually the instigator of the first recorded democratic action when Adam and Eve, outvoted God. It was called the Fall. But just for the record, Samuel Johnson originally said Satan was the first Whig. And I suspect Alinsky, who may have been evil but was not stupid, was pretty well read. I figure that's kind of where he stole the quote from.
Okay. I don't understand how, because part of the documentary it showed how he influenced church officials.
Yeah.
Given that dedication, I don't see how people let themselves be deceived like that. I don't see how he could explain that away.
People want to be deceived. They love it. I mean, look. Right now, we are in the midst of a post-electoral jumping up and down in this country. And, the Russians brought us Trump. And who knows? Maybe they did do their best to interfere. Unlike ourselves in other countries' elections, it's not like we'd ever want an election to go our way. We're silly billies. What do you want? You had clerics in those days, especially in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, when clerics wanted to appear, the bishops wanted to appear very for the people and into social justice and all that, but didn't really know a whole lot about how to go about it, or really anything about anything in this area. Alinsky's disciples came along and said, we can show you how to help the poor. And who doesn't want to help the poor? It's like helping the children. All you have to do to sell anything to people is to say, it's for the children. Well, really? Giving them bubonic plague is going to help? Yes, it's for the children. Well, it's the same with people that sort of, it's for the poor. Now, the fact that they'll have no faith and be filled with envy and extremely unhappy by the time we're done with them doesn't change the fact that it's for them. So, you got to remember, too, a lot of bishops of that time were not really theologians, unlike today, of course. They were more God's bureaucrats. They knew how to administer, how to keep the diocesan machinery burbling along and bringing in cash and doing what it does. Not that well, considering the numbers of parishes and schools that started closing. But anyway, the point is that was their emphasis. They didn't know a great deal about theology and about the needs of people? None. I mean, the proof of the pudding is that we don't evangelize. The poor need the truth, just the way the wealthy do, even before they need money. It's amazing to me that in 30 or 40 years, for instance, as an example, here in the Southwest, of emphasizing outreach to Hispanics, the church has never lost so many of them to the evangelistas.
Wow.
And that's because the evangelistas talk about things like, oh, I don't know, God and Jesus. We don't. And then we turn around and think that the way to keep them from going Protestant is to make the Mass in Spanish as Protestant as we possibly can. And I don't want to say we're stupid, but it would be hard to deny it if someone challenged us. And into that milieu of ignorance steps Saul Alinsky. I can help you reach out to the poor and feel good about yourself, Your Excellency. Who doesn't want to feel good about themselves?
All right. The second documentary I wanted to talk about is The Hidden Rebellion, produced by our friend Daniel Rabardin. It's on the French Revolution and the subsequent genocide it committed on its own people, Vendee. You and I went to a screening of it at our local parish to show our support. You even gave a really nice speech at it. Can you talk about what you thought of The Hidden Rebellion and why it's important to watch this?
Well, I thought it was very well done, of course, and it was wonderful that it was in English, because it's an area that most of us, certainly most of us Americans, don't know about. The idea of Catholics being willing to fight and die for their faith against persecution, very similar to the Cristeros, whose story was first brought to most Americans who know about it through the movie For the Greater Glory a couple of years ago. Very, very important thing. To couple those two with something like Command for All Seasons. And it's a reminder that our religion is not something we're supposed to be passive about. It's something we have to actively protect and defend. Sometimes in history through violence, but always one way or the other, because of course we're dealing with the world, the flesh, and the devil at all times, who seek to squelch the faith in us. And being reminded of people like that who are willing to lose everything for their faith should be a particular lesson to those of us who are merely inconvenienced by holding on to it. What a rebuke to us. But I'm sure we're all very, very nice people. I know I am. It's a very inspiring film, and I really hope as many people as possible see it.
Why do you think this part of the French Revolution is so obscure?
Well, it's not elsewhere, of course, but it is in this country. And I think it's for a large part of the same reason that we don't think a lot about the whites in the Russian Civil War, or the Catholic opposition to Napoleon in Tyrol, or really the Royalists in the Latin American Wars of Independence. The problem with us as a country that was founded on a revolution is that we immediately think the revolution is a good in itself. And so we unconsciously tend to discount the opponents of any revolution, regardless of what the content of that revolution was. The flip side, of course, is that if we didn't do that, we would have to perhaps look again at our own loyalists and our own revolution, and that might cause self-doubt. And as you know, self-doubt is one of the few remaining sins available to us today. I mean, who are we to judge?
Okay. William Johnson sent in a question. What is the opinion of Mr. Coulombe concerning Action Francaise and the Vichy regime in France? I know many French Catholics tend to have an interest and love in both, but I've also heard of poor relations between Action Francaise and the Church. Was this doctrinal in nature or a political move?
It was both. Basically, Action Francaise was an organization that still exists, founded in France in the wake of the Dreyfus trial in the 1890s by a gentleman called Charles Maurras. Now, Charles Maurras, a fascinating figure. He was, for a huge chunk of his life, really until the last 5 years of it, he lost his faith pretty early, and he became a positivist. But he was a big nationalist, and so he saw, as anyone who would look at things unblinkered would see, that Catholicism was a big chunk of what made France France, of what created the country. So too with the monarchy. So he was at once in favor of the restoration of the monarchy and in favor of the restoration of the status of Catholicism in French life. The problem was that he didn't believe in the Catholic faith. He believed in it as important because of its role as the primary expression of French culture and the French nationality. If you see the difference.
Yeah.
I mean, in reality, the French ethos, the French culture is important only to the degree that it serves as an incarnation of the faith. Not the other way around.
Right, yeah, he got it reversed.
Yeah, and you see the same thing with a lot of Catholic allied thinkers in continental Europe. In Spain, Portugal, Italy, various other places, they valued the faith for its importance to the country rather than the country for its importance to the faith. And that was the doctrinal problem. That, however, did not come up for a long, long time. As they found in the 1890s. Well, the vast majority of members of l'Action Francaise were Catholics and believing Catholics, the way the vast majority of French monarchists were. And the vast majority of activist French Catholics were monarchists, which, as you can imagine, after the Republic came in, gave all sorts of problems between the church and the state. In the 1890s, Leo XIII called for the French to rally to the Republic. But the problem was that for them, they were loyal to the king in exile.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, that was basically the Pope asking for them to be treasonous. If you could imagine a Pope saying to American Catholics, give up your loyalty to the Constitution, that would put us in a very unpleasant position.
Yeah.
And the worst of it was that the ones who were in that position were the most active elements of the French church. Well, that kind of, and of course Leo XIII did that in hopes of rescuing the Concordat, whereby the French state supported the church. You know, paid the salaries of the priests, paid for the upkeep on churches and so on. It didn't work. And so in 1905, the French government broke the Concordat and seized all the church's property and expelled all the religious orders.
Wow.
That's why today every French church that was built before 1905 belongs to the government. So, what was built since 1905 does not. But that's a minority of buildings and so on. Anyway, so World War I comes along, and you have the Union Sacrée, as it was called, the Sacred Union. And the French Catholic Royalists and the Republicans and everybody else rallied together to defeat the Germans. After the war, l'Action Française and Maurras become more and more and more influential, not just in France, but in Belgium, in Switzerland, in Canada, French Canada, and in New England, the French-Canadian communities in New England.
Okay.
Well, this, of course, is all by the by, but Maurras's big disciple in Quebec was a priest, Monsignor Lionel Groux, who was a great man and an historian of France and French Canada and so forth. He had a lot of disciples in this country. Well, St. Pius X had been very friendly with l'Action Française. Benedict XV somewhat less so. Pius XI was very keen on getting the church out of politics. And he was convinced by his Secretary of State to condemn l'Action Française in 1926. This caused a huge problem. He excommunicated those members of l'Action Française who refused to leave the organization. A cardinal, Cardinal Biot, gave up his red hat in protest. Because on the one hand, Maurras was, as I say, not a believing Catholic, but on the other hand, his ideas were held by a ton of believing Catholics. And again, as with the Ralliement under Leo XIII, some of the most active in doing the work of the church. So this was very, very upsetting to a lot of people. All right, well, Pius XI dies, 1939 comes along. In 1939, Pius XI dies. Pius XII becomes Pope. What's the first thing he does? He lifts the ban on l'Action Francaise. But, the damage from 1926 till 1939, if you were a member of l'Action Francaise, you couldn't get a Catholic funeral.
Wow.
You couldn't be buried in a Catholic cemetery. So, and the fact that Pius XII had no problem lifting it when l'Action Francaise didn't change their position shows you that the initial problem was unjust.
Yeah.
I'm very fond of Pius XI, but he did some really stupid things, and that was one of them. Another, of course, was selling out the Cristeros, but that's another story. I'm not saying selling out the Cristeros is a bad thing. Who are we to judge? But, to quote a later pontiff. But this was a pretty bad thing. Pius XII fixed it, as it were. But the damage was done in a lot of ways. Well, then World War II breaks out, and France, as you know, in 1940 was defeated in 6 weeks. And the northern half of the country was occupied by Germany. Now, something you may not be aware of is that French society was very polarized, as I kind of intimated beforehand. And to add insult to injury, the communists in France, who were very powerful, were pro-German when the war broke out, because Stalin was pro-German. They only just started getting into the resistance in a big way and then taking it over after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. But during the initial invasion, they blew up bridges behind French troops, so they couldn't retreat, things like that. And so for some reason, a lot of people didn't like them very much. I don't know why. Well, France was prostrate, and along came Marshal Pétain. Now, Marshal Pétain was the victor of Verdun. He was a big World War I hero, and he seemed to incarnate all that was best in France. So he took over unoccupied France, and instead of sitting in Paris, he sat in a spa town called Vichy, which is why it's called the Vichy regime. Well, initially, he was greeted with open arms by everybody, even de Gaulle. And the idea was that through a return to French traditions, they would regenerate the country so that France could take its place once more amongst the great nations. And of course, the Germans said, and being Nazis, of course, they lied about everything. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but they did. Who are we to judge, at the end of the day? What can we say about anything, honestly? I mean, But Marshal Pétain was under the impression that he would be allowed to address the regeneration of France, thus aiding all of Europe, and the Germans would be happy with this. And they certainly thought they were. They said the Germans said they were. So the first year or two, first year anyway, of the Vichy regime, all sorts of traditional French Catholic royalist types, Action Francaise types, and so on, staffed the Vichy government. All the colonial empire, with a few exceptions, swore allegiance to Vichy. This was the French government. And remember that Pétain had been voted his authority by the last French parliament. So strictly speaking, that was it. But in London, a former disciple of Pétain declared that France was not defeated and would go on fighting. His name was Charles de Gaulle, and his group was called Free France. Well, the Vichy government did a lot of things, actually, some of which still economically and so forth are still with us. And they wanted to revolutionize French life and get rid of the decadence which they believed had brought about the defeat. The Germans, of course, had other plans. And after about a year, they began putting pressure on Pétain to replace the traditional Catholic types with old socialists, real Nazis, people like that. There, of course, was also pressure on Pétain to deal with the Jewish problem. So at first, when he was in a position to, he resisted doing anything for the Germans in that area other than sending them the Jews who had German or other occupied citizenship. But he wouldn't let them take the native-born Jews. But there was pressure kept building up on him. And then, in 1942, something extraordinary happened. I told you that the Empire, the French Empire, rallied to him. Piece by piece, it got conquered by de Gaulle and his allies. Now, the thing about de Gaulle was that Franklin Roosevelt hated his guts and wanted very, very much to get rid of him. And de Gaulle was too smart for Roosevelt, though, I have to say. For instance, Roosevelt said that he didn't want Martinique and Guadeloupe, which were two French islands in the West Indies, still are, to be taken from Vichy by the Free French. They should be occupied by the Americans. But de Gaulle got them before Roosevelt did. Mm-hmm. And in both cases, the Americans arrived and they were already in Free French hands. And de Gaulle was annoyed. Anyway, so in 1942, the British and Americans attacked North Africa, French North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. In response, the Germans occupied the rest of Vichy France. But Pétain ordered the Navy at Toulon to scuttle their ships. And they did. This was a deal he had had with Churchill before the fall of France. That if they were ever in that position, in order to keep the French Navy from falling into German hands and tipping the scales, they would do that. He honored that commitment, which is something people never remember. All right, so where does this leave us? In 1944, France is falling, and the Germans arrest Pétain and stick him in a POW camp, and that's where he sits out the rest of the war. Now, as you can imagine, and then of course by this time the communists had taken over a big chunk of the resistance. And after the Germans were thrown out, they spent the first few months getting back at people. Not just because they'd been collaborators, but sometimes just because they weren't communist. The suppression, or the épuration, that's something people don't talk about. So, why do Catholics love Maurras and Vichy? The answer is because during the ideas of the one and the attempted program of the other, we're very pro-Catholic. That's why. Pétain, of course, because he did not defend the Jews to the liking of people who weren't there at the time, is considered a horrible anti-Semite by some. But I don't believe the record really upholds that.
Okay. All right, let's talk about the current state of Catholicism in France a little bit.
Do we have to?
Yes.
Okay.
When we were at the premiere the other day, Daniel Rabardin had said something that really raised my eyebrows. He said, each year in France, 500 Muslims convert to Catholicism. But also 5,000 Catholics convert to Islam. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, to give you a kind of parable, let's go back to the late 1500s. France was in a civil war between Catholics and Protestants. The head of the Protestant party was the heir to the throne, but there was no way he could become king as a Protestant. It's often said that he said Paris is worth a mass. That's not exactly what it was about. He convened a debate between Huguenot and Catholic theologians, and he asked the Protestant theologians, "Can I be saved as a Catholic?" They said, "Yeah, if you're virtuous, blah, blah, blah." He asked Cardinal Duperron, who was himself a convert, "Can I be saved as a Protestant?" The cardinal said, "No, you can't, you'll go to hell." So Henry said, "Well, the Protestants say I can't go to heaven as a Catholic. The Catholics say I can't go to heaven as a Protestant. Seems kind of obvious to me." Well, fast forward, the French hierarchy tend to be very liberal, and very outreachy and ecumenical and all this, and one faith is very like another, and into dialogue. Well, that sounds nice, but the average person is looking for certainty. This takes us back to what I said earlier about the Hispanics here and why so many of them become evangelistas. It's the same phenomenon. Because we say, well, doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're a nice person. The Muslims say, if you're not Muslim, you'll go to hell.
A lot more certain, a lot more concrete.
Mm-hmm. And remember that obviously those 5,000 are not very well-formed Catholics. Not that many Catholics are well-formed anywhere today. But they're not. But you take someone who's vaguely Catholic. Maybe he's been through 12 years of Catholic school, so he doesn't know anything about his religion. But he feels as though he does. And he's had 12 years of being told that it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're nice. And blah, 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 blah. And then you've got the Imam coming along and say, submit to God, submit to Allah, or go to hell. Which is the clearer message.
Muslims, for sure.
But then again, who are we to judge?
Boy, you are not letting up today on that.
No, it's just because the author of that statement has shown himself so judgmental in the past month, going on about how younger Catholics are rigid. Far be it from me to judge the actions of anyone, and certainly as a Californian, I'm not capable of doing so. But I would just say it's probably not smart attacking the future, especially if you're charged with the well-being of an organization.
Perhaps he doesn't realize that that's the future.
I'm sure he hopes it isn't. But you know how hopes are, we all have them.
All right, for our last question, let's get a little controversial.
Oh no.
As if, yeah. Okay.
Perish the thought.
Mark Williams asks...
Bunnies, beautiful little bunnies, grazing in the woods.
What should we believe about separation of church and state?
Well, speaking of bunnies, it's what should we believe about the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy? The separation of church and state doesn't exist. It has never existed, and it never will exist. There may be separation between my church and the state, his church and the state. But every state that has ever existed has an established faith, a animating principle that determines both vaguely the way people have to pretend they live the rules and gives legitimacy to the rulership. Every society has that. Under the Soviet Union, it was communism. And that functioned as a state religion. There is no God and Lenin is his prophet. That was the creed. With us, it's secular humanism. But if you violate its dictates, you will be smacked around. As you'll be smacked around if you violate the dictates of any established church, anywhere. That's the way things are in human societies. Ours is particularly invidious because we pretend it's not so. But we pretend a lot of things.
We like to pretend.
Yeah. When you live in fantasy land, it's all good. But at any rate, that's who are we to judge after all. But what makes one human society different from another is the nature of the state church. You see. So if one society's state church is Catholicism, and another's is ritualized cannibalism, there will be differences in those two societies, and those two very different faiths will determine what those differences are.
I see.
Or, say it was sacramentalized infanticide instead of cannibalism. Oh, I'm sorry, what we have. Sorry, that wasn't funny. Was it?
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
All right, never you mind. But that said, what are we to think of separation of church and state? I don't know. It doesn't exist. We may want the current church separated from our state, but something else will have to take its place.
I just would like to bring up that Pius IX, in his Syllabus of Errors, number 55 on that list is that the church ought to be separate. It's evil to believe that the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church.
This is true. I mean, objectively speaking, the Catholic Church ought to be the state church of every country, because the Catholic Church alone has the fullness of truth, and under her teachings alone will society be ordered to its right ends, which is both the temporal welfare of the people and their spiritual welfare. But there will be union of the state and some church, even if it isn't called a church or recognized as a church.
Okay. But I just wanted to touch a little bit on the syllabus, because
Okay.
this is, I've always found this to be a really important document. The way Pius IX structured it, he structured it in a very authoritative way. It's a big, giant list of things that are evil to believe.
Yeah.
But is the Syllabus of Errors considered to be part of the Magisterium of the Church?
Considered by whom?
Whoever the authorities are.
Well, indeed. And who are we to judge? I don't know. No, see, the problem you've got with this, firstly, there's the extraordinary magisterium and there's the ordinary magisterium. Now, the extraordinary magisterium are things like the definitions of the councils, the creeds, of which we have 4. Most people don't know that. They only think we have 2. The infallible proclamations of the popes, of which there have been a total of 3. That is the extraordinary magisterium. The ordinary magisterium is the doctrinal output by the church. Now here's where it gets a little weird. On the face of it, nothing could be more authoritative within the ordinary magisterium than the Syllabus of Errors.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll have things like the letter of the Holy Office to Father Feeney that apparently can trump the declarations or the definitions of councils. You have what I like to call creeping infallibilism, which is since 1870 in the definition of infallibility. More and more stuff in the popular mind becomes part of the ordinary magisterium. Encyclicals, yeah, I can see that, because that's a direct communication. And you'll notice that the syllabus quotes mostly encyclicals. Allocutions, that is, mere speeches. Interviews on planes. And then it's not just the Pope or the Holy See. What's been added to it by, again, nothing authoritative is stated in this. It's just been done. Bishops' conferences, their pronouncements on things. Then individual bishops. No one has ever authoritatively defined what the ordinary magisterium is.
How do you know there is an ordinary magisterium?
Because they always said there is. That's why. And they always talk about it. And
Who's they?
The popes and the Holy See. The Holy Office, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith.
I mean, what does that mean, talk about it? Were they
Well, they
giving an
mention it.
interview about it and they mentioned it?
No, I mean to say they'll mention the ordinary magisterium in passing. They'll say, we know from the ordinary magisterium and so on and so forth. But frankly, it has never been concretely defined. Which is something, and all joking aside, and I do hope, ladies and gentlemen, you realize I've been joking a lot. I'm in a funny mood today. Probably comes of it being the first of the O antiphons today. O sapientia, O wisdom. Anyway, the truth of the matter is that there is an ordinary magisterium, but we do not know its bounds. And that's very, very bad.
Yeah.
The dubia that the 4 cardinals proposed.
Yeah.
That's very much produced. I mean, the conditions produced by this weirdness are what produced the 4 questions, the 4 dubia. Because, all right, well, what's authoritative, what isn't? What's real, what's memorex? If a pope contradicts prior teaching, and more than that, prior infallible teaching. Why? How can he do so? How can he do that? Upon what authority? That's what he's being asked. And he won't answer. Not yet, anyway. It could be he's going to come up with something really wonderful that'll make us all wow with both its holiness and cleverness.
You didn't say that last show. You predicted he was not going to.
Well, that was my concrete prediction. This is just a surmise.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we're in the end times. Maybe Aslan's coming back. You don't know. I don't know. All sorts of things could happen. Maybe I won the lottery.
We're looking to you for answers.
Oh, that. Well, last week I was speaking authoritatively. This week I'm shooting from the cuff. No, I mean, he's, all joking aside, and again, I could certainly be wrong because I can't read the man's mind. But my suspicion is that he won't answer it because he can't answer it. There's no answer to give those questions, except I'm wrong. And I think he's too humble to give that kind of an answer.
Wow. Okay, that's it for this show. But before we go, I have to tell you guys a little secret. I love when you guys send in questions. Because when you send in questions, that means I don't have to spend time thinking up good questions. And oftentimes you guys submit better questions than what I could come up with myself. So please keep on sending in the questions. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.
I have to add one thing, though. This is our penultimate podcast for the year. 2016 is staggering on to its inevitable end. And little baby New Year, 2017, is already in the playpen, getting ready. So, it's been a great time so far, ladies and gentlemen. And again, forgive me if you're at all scandalized by my levity in dealing with these things. But I'll leave you with a thought from my late lamented father. You can laugh, or you can weep. And laughing is so much more discreet. Merry Christmas.